A millionaire swaps his penthouse for the streets, seeking the truth about hardship. But when he meets a man who knows his deepest secret, his entire life changes in ways he never expected. Ethan Cole had everything. His name was synonymous with success, a self-made millionaire, CEO of a global investment firm, and the proud owner of a glass-walled penthouse overlooking the New York skyline. To the world, he was a symbol of power and influence. But beneath the tailored suits and calculated decisions, something gnawed at him. A question he couldn't shake. He leaned against the floor-to-ceiling window of his office, gazing at the city below. The traffic, the hurried steps of people on the sidewalks, the distant hum of life that never stopped moving. It all felt so detached. He could predict stock markets, negotiate billion-dollar deals, and shape economies. But there was one thing he didn't understand: what it truly meant to struggle. Ethan had built his empire from scratch, yet he hadn't tasted hardship in decades. The thought disturbed him. Could he still endure the kind of adversity that millions of people faced daily? Did he even know what real hardship was anymore? His father, a man who had once worked 3 jobs to put food on the table, had always warned him, "The higher you climb, the further you are from the ground. One day, you'll need to remember what it feels like to stand there." But Ethan had dismissed those words. Until now. A soft knock at the door snapped him from his thoughts. His assistant, Natalie, entered, holding a neatly stacked folder. "Sir, the board meeting is in 10 minutes. Ethan nodded but didn't move. His mind was elsewhere. "Natalie," he said suddenly, "what do you think would happen if I lost everything? If I woke up tomorrow and had nothing?" Natalie hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "Well, I suppose you'd rebuild it all, sir. That's what you do." But that wasn't the answer Ethan wanted. He turned back to the window, his reflection merging with the cityscape. He needed to know. What would happen if the world saw him as nothing? If no one recognized his name? And in that moment, an idea took root. One that would change his life forever. That night, Ethan sat in his penthouse, staring at a single well-worn item on his desk, a tattered brown leather wallet. It had been his father's, its edges frayed from years of use. Inside was an old photograph of their family, taken long before money had entered Ethan's life. His father's face, roughened by time and exhaustion, stared back at him. Ethan clenched the wallet in his hand. He had spent his life making sure he would never go back to those days. But now, he realized, he had no idea what those days had actually felt like. And so, he made a decision. He would disappear for a week. Leave behind his wealth, his name, and his power. No phones, no credit cards, just the clothes on his back and $20 in his pocket. He would become homeless and walk the streets like millions of others who had no safety net. He called Natalie the next morning. "I'm taking a leave of absence," he told her. "For how long?" she asked. Ethan exhaled slowly. 7 days. When she pressed for details, he gave none. He knew she wouldn't understand. No one would. But he had to do this. He needed to know the truth. Dressed in a simple hoodie, worn-out jeans and sneakers that had seen better days, Ethan stepped out onto the streets of New York City. He had left his penthouse at dawn, leaving behind every comfort he had known. Within hours, the world had already started to treat him differently. People averted their eyes when he passed. No friendly nods, no polite smiles. The business executives who once scrambled to shake his hand now ignored him completely. Hunger gnawed at his stomach by midday, but he refused to spend his $20. He needed to stretch it out. He had seen people digging through trash bins before. Now, for the first time, he understood why. By nightfall, the cold began to seep into his bones. He wandered into a crowded subway station, where he saw others like him, men and women huddled in corners, wrapped in layers of old clothing, their faces gaunt from hunger. He chose a bench and sat down, exhaustion pulling at him. He was invisible now. Just another nameless figure in a sea of forgotten people. Then, a voice interrupted his thoughts. "You're new here." Ethan turned to see a man sitting a few feet away, his dark eyes studying him with quiet curiosity. He was older, his salt and pepper beard unkempt, his clothes layered for warmth. "I guess you could say that," Ethan admitted. The man smirked. "You don't belong here." Ethan frowned. "What makes you say that?" The man gestured to his hands. "You're clean. Haven't learned how to blend in yet." Ethan swallowed hard. How long before he stopped looking different? "Name's Joe," the man continued. "You got a name?" Ethan hesitated, then answered, "Adam." It wasn't a lie, not really. It was his middle name, the one no one used. Joe gave a small nod. "Well, Adam, if you want to survive out here, you better start learning fast." Ethan had no idea how right he was. Joe became Ethan's reluctant guide to the world of the homeless. "First rule," Joe said as they stood outside a shelter that night. "Never trust anyone who says they're here to help unless they got proof." Ethan frowned. "Aren't shelters supposed to be safe?" Joe let out a bitter chuckle. "Safe? Sure, but that don't mean they're good." They stepped inside, and Ethan's stomach churned. The air was thick with unwashed bodies, the low hum of murmured conversations, and the occasional cough echoing through the overcrowded space. A worker handed Ethan a thin blanket and gestured toward the rows of cots. Some were already occupied, their inhabitants curled into themselves, trying to disappear. Ethan sat down on the cot, the mattress stiff beneath him. This wasn't a luxury hotel. There was no comfort here, only survival. That night, as he lay awake listening to the sounds of the shelter, he realized something unsettling. He had only been out here one day, and already the world felt different. By the end of the week, he wouldn't just know hardship, he would live it. Ethan Cole had once stood at the top of the world, but now, as he walked the cold streets with aching feet and an empty stomach, he realized how quickly the world could forget a man. The city that had once bowed before him now ignored him entirely. He was no longer a name spoken in boardrooms or printed in newspapers. He was just another face among the nameless, a shadow blending into the alleyways. The first thing he noticed was how people avoided looking at him. He had spent years shaking hands with politicians, brokers, and business moguls, but here, in the depths of society, people crossed the street to avoid him. A woman waiting at a bus stop clutched her purse tighter when he walked past. A man sitting at a coffee shop glanced at him, then quickly turned away. It was as if poverty carried an invisible stain, one that no one wanted to acknowledge, let alone touch. Hunger gnawed at his insides, sharper than he had expected. He had skipped meals before, during late-night meetings, long flights, or days when he was too busy closing deals, but this was different. This hunger wasn't by choice. His body trembled with weakness, his vision blurred at times, and yet he knew that spending even $1 of the 20 he had brought along meant losing another piece of his survival. He walked past restaurants with bright neon signs, the scent of grilled meat and freshly baked bread lingering in the air, but those doors were closed to him now. He had never realized how much power a single meal held until it was no longer an option. By the second day, Ethan understood that survival wasn't just about finding food or shelter, it was about becoming invisible. The longer someone looked lost, the more vulnerable they became. He watched those who had lived on the streets for years, noting their movements. They didn't wander aimlessly or hesitate at intersections. They walked with purpose, even if that purpose was just to avoid trouble. He learned that certain corners were claimed territory. Some alleys, though dark and isolated, were safer than overcrowded shelters where desperation could turn into danger within seconds. He learned how to layer his clothing against the biting cold, stuffing newspapers under his hoodie to keep warmth trapped. He found out that kindness, when given by strangers, often came with strings attached: pity, condescension, or an expectation that he would disappear after they had done their good deed for the day. Ethan discovered that the biggest enemy of homelessness wasn't just hunger or exhaustion, it was time. Hours stretched endlessly when there was nothing to do, no place to go, no goal to accomplish. He had lived his life by schedules, by meetings and deadlines, by carefully constructed routines. Now, he existed in a space where time didn't move forward, it simply stood still. When the temperature dropped at night, the city's cruelty became even more apparent. He had assumed shelters would be easy to access, that they would provide warmth and a bed to anyone who needed one. Instead, he found long lines, overcrowded rooms, and the realization that even among the homeless, there was a hierarchy. Those who had been on the streets longest knew how to navigate the system, how to claim a bed before newcomers had the chance. Ethan, with his unshaken pride and lack of experience, found himself at the bottom of that chain. He spent his first 2 nights sleeping outside. The hard pavement became his mattress, the sound of distant sirens his lullaby. He had underestimated the sheer physical toll of homelessness, the aching joints from sleeping in awkward positions, the way his body stiffened in the cold, the way exhaustion never truly left but instead settled into his bones. By the 3rd night, he secured a spot in a shelter, but it wasn't the relief he had expected. The air inside was thick with desperation. Fights broke out over blankets. The staff was overwhelmed, their patience worn thin. He watched as a young boy curled against his mother on a cot, the mother's arms wrapped around him as if shielding him from the world. The sight made something inside him twist. He had built wealth, but he had never built anything that truly helped people like them. It was on the 5th day that Ethan's pride finally shattered. Hunger had weakened him to the point where he no longer cared about appearances. He found himself standing in line at a soup kitchen, waiting for a meal he once would have overlooked without a second thought. When the volunteer handed him a tray, the warmth of the food in his hands nearly brought tears to his eyes. He sat in a corner, eating slowly, savoring every bite. That night, as he lay on the floor of a shelter, he thought about the countless people he had passed on the streets before this. How he had assumed they had made poor choices, that they simply hadn't tried hard enough to escape poverty. He had believed in meritocracy, in the idea that hard work alone determined success. But now, with nothing left, he realized how fragile success truly was. How quickly a single stroke of bad luck could erase everything. On the 7th day, something unexpected happened. He met a man who knew his name. Not Adam, the alias he had given, but his real name, Ethan Cole. The man was older, his clothes ragged but his eyes sharp. He sat on a park bench, watching Ethan with recognition. "You don't belong here," the man finally said. Ethan's heart pounded. He had spent the last week trying to blend in, to disappear. But this man had seen through him. "I know you," the man continued. "I used to work for you, before the company downsized, before I lost everything." Ethan felt the ground shift beneath him. This man, this stranger had once been part of his world, a world that had abandoned him without a second thought, a world that Ethan himself had built. For the first time in his life, Ethan Cole felt the weight of what it meant to truly be powerless. And in that moment, he realized he could never return to his life as it was before. Something had to change. He had to change. Ethan spent the next few days observing, listening, and learning from those around him. He no longer moved through the city with a businessman's mindset, but with the understanding of someone who had lived through struggle. He spoke to single mothers who had been abandoned, veterans who had been cast aside, and individuals who had lost everything in an instant. Each story was a lesson in resilience, each voice an echo of the injustice woven into the city's foundation. He realized that money, power, and influence could only do so much if not wielded responsibly. He had spent years climbing to the top, but what if he could use his knowledge to change the system itself? The journey had started as an experiment, but now it was a mission. He could not go back to who he was before. By the time Ethan left the streets, he was no longer the same man who had entered them. The real work was only beginning. Ethan knew that walking away with only lessons learned wasn't enough. He had the power to make a difference, and for the first time in his life, he understood what that truly meant. He had met people who had no escape, no way out, and he knew he had the means to change that. But would the world listen? Could he truly create something that mattered? With newfound determination, Ethan vowed that his wealth would no longer be a symbol of status, it would be a tool for change. Ethan Cole had walked away from his life of privilege with the intention of understanding hardship, but as he stepped back into the polished marble lobby of his corporate headquarters, it felt like he had just awoken from a long, disorienting dream. The security guards greeted him with respect again, His assistant scrambled to reschedule meetings, and within moments he was thrust back into a world where wealth meant influence, where power was measured in assets and investments, not in the desperate fight for shelter and food. But something inside him had shifted. The life he had reclaimed no longer felt like it belonged to him. As he walked through the halls, Ethan caught sight of the framed awards that lined the walls, testaments to his business acumen, his strategic mind, his ability to turn numbers into profit. He had always prided himself on those achievements, but now he saw them for what they truly were, symbols of a system that rewarded power but ignored the powerless. His board of directors had questions, concerned about his unexplained absence. He gave them the answers they wanted, a vague story of needing time for personal reflection, a renewed focus on the company's direction. But inside he wrestled with a single pressing thought. What had his company taken from others? Who had suffered because of his relentless pursuit of wealth? Ethan knew that to change the system, he had to understand its faults. He ordered a private audit of his company's financial dealings, instructing his chief financial officer to scrutinize everything from acquisitions to workforce layoffs. What he uncovered made his stomach churn. One particular document stood out, an old cost-cutting decision that had resulted in the closure of several manufacturing plants. The names of the laid-off employees meant nothing to him at first until he reached one entry: Joseph Tanner, the same man who had recognized him on the streets. Ethan's chest tightened. He hadn't just encountered a random homeless man. He had met someone directly affected by his own business decisions. The same decisions that had allowed him to build his empire had also destroyed lives. Determined to find Joseph again, Ethan returned to the streets that night, dressed in the same worn clothes he had discarded days earlier. The sights and smells were still fresh in his memory, and he knew exactly where to look. After hours of searching, Ethan found Joseph in the same park where they had last spoken. The older man was sitting on a bench, his fingers curled against the cold, staring into the distance as if trapped in a memory he couldn't escape. Ethan approached carefully. "Joseph," he said quietly. Joseph turned, his gaze narrowing with suspicion. "So, you're back," he muttered. "Did you enjoy your little experiment?" The words stung, but Ethan didn't flinch. "I didn't know," he admitted. "I didn't know what happened to you." Joseph let out a bitter laugh. "That's the thing about people like you. You never know. You sit in your glass towers making decisions, but you never see the consequences." Ethan swallowed hard, his own shame growing heavier. "I want to make it right," Joseph scoffed. "Make it right? You think throwing money at the problem fixes everything?" He shook his head. "It's too late for me, Cole. I lost my home. I lost my family. I lost everything. And you didn't even notice." The weight of Joseph's words sank deep into Ethan's bones. He had come expecting forgiveness, expecting a chance to undo the damage, but now he saw the truth. Some wounds could never be healed. As Ethan left the park, his mind reeled with Joseph's words. He had spent his entire life believing he was a builder of success, but now he wondered if he had only been an architect of ruin. He knew he needed to do more than just donate money. He needed to dismantle the very machine that had created men like Joseph. But when he returned to his office the next day, a storm was already waiting for him. A breaking news alert flashed across the television screens in the office lobby. Ethan Cole under investigation. Embezzlement scandal unfolds. His heart pounded as he scanned the screen, his name appearing alongside accusations that he had funneled millions into offshore accounts. Documents were shown, signed under his authority, detailing financial transactions he had never seen before. A cold realization settled over him. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was an attack. Before he could react, his assistant rushed toward him, panic in her eyes. "Sir, the board is demanding an emergency meeting. They want answers." Ethan clenched his fists. He had spent a week on the streets, learning about loss and desperation. But now, he was about to experience another kind of survival. The fight for his own name. The emergency boardroom meeting was already underway when Ethan entered. The room was filled with murmurs, the board members whispering among themselves. Some looked at him with disappointment, others with quiet calculation. His longtime rival, Richard Kavanaugh, sat at the far end of the table, his expression unreadable. "We need an explanation," one board member demanded. "The evidence is overwhelming." Ethan remained calm, though his pulse was racing. "This isn't my doing. Someone inside the company orchestrated this." A scoff came from Richard. "Are you saying you're being framed? By whom?" Ethan met his rival's gaze, the unspoken challenge clear between them. He had spent years climbing to the top, but he had also made enemies along the way. Someone wanted him out. Someone wanted control of everything he had built. "The real question," Ethan said, his voice steady, "is who stands to gain from my downfall?" The boardroom fell into silence. He knew he had no allies in this fight, at least not yet. But he wasn't going to let them strip away his life without uncovering the truth. As Ethan left the meeting, his mind raced. He needed to find the source of the accusations, uncover the forgery, and expose the person behind it all. But he had to act quickly. The company he had built was slipping through his fingers, and the world was watching. He returned to his office, shutting the door behind him. Pulling out his phone, he called the one person he knew would help, Natalie, his assistant, the only person he trusted. "We have a problem," he said as soon as she answered. "I know," she replied, "and I think I know where to start." Ethan exhaled. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about justice, for Joseph, for the people his company had wronged, and for the truth itself. As the city skyline twinkled beyond his window, Ethan Cole braced himself for the battle ahead. He had seen the world through two different lenses now, and he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going down without a fight. Ethan sat alone in his dimly lit penthouse, the weight of the world pressing against his chest like an immovable force. Just days ago he had returned from the streets, believing he could right the wrongs he had unknowingly inflicted on others. But now, he was the one cast out, stripped of power, and branded a criminal. The accusations of embezzlement had shattered his reputation, and every news outlet painted him as nothing more than a corrupt businessman. The walls that once signified his success now felt like a cage. Calls from former allies went unanswered. His name, once revered in financial circles, was now synonymous with disgrace. His accounts were frozen, his assets seized, and his influence, once so absolute, had been reduced to nothing. But what haunted him the most wasn't the loss of his fortune. It was the realization that he had spent his entire life chasing an illusion of security, only to be brought down by the very system he had helped build. The thought gnawed at him. Was this what Joseph had felt when he lost everything? He scoured through company files, looking for any hint of the sabotage that had ensnared him. Every piece of evidence pointed to him, yet he knew someone else had orchestrated it. Richard Kavanaugh's smug expression during the board meeting still played in his mind. It had to be him. He had waited for the right moment to strike, and now Ethan was drowning while Richard took control of everything he had built. As he searched for an escape, an unexpected knock echoed through his empty home. It was Natalie. She entered, her face etched with worry, clutching a folder in her hands. Without a word, she placed it on the table and opened it. Inside were records, hidden transactions, forged signatures, and sealed correspondence between Richard and an unknown entity. "I don't know who else to trust," she whispered. "But if we don't move fast, there won't be anything left to fight for." Ethan's hands trembled as he flipped through the documents. It was the proof he needed. But there was a problem. The real culprit had done more than just frame him. They had covered every possible escape route. He had to act now, or he would lose everything. As night fell, Ethan left his penthouse for the first time in days. He walked the empty streets, the same ones where he had once wandered as a man with nothing. He had thought he understood struggle then, but now he faced a different kind of battle, the fight to reclaim his name and his purpose. The neon lights flickered overhead as he passed by a shelter, the very place he had sought warmth in just weeks before. He hesitated at the entrance, uncertain if he had the right to step inside again. But something drew him forward. Inside, the same faces he had once met sat huddled together, whispering, surviving. And then he saw Joseph. The older man looked up, his eyes filled with something Ethan couldn't quite place: pity, anger, or maybe understanding. Without a word, Ethan sat beside him. He had nothing left to offer, no promises, no money, just the truth. "I was wrong," Ethan admitted. "About everything." Joseph nodded slowly, the silence stretching between them. For the first time in Ethan's life, there was no deal to close, no profit to be made, only a lesson that had cost him everything. In that moment of shared silence, something shifted within Ethan. He had spent his life believing power came from control, from wealth, from the ability to shape the world around him. But now, stripped of everything, he realized that true power came from resilience, from the ability to rebuild, not for personal gain, but for something greater. He turned to Joseph. "I don't have much left," he said, "but I have enough to fight back. I need your help." Joseph studied him for a long time before finally speaking. "You want to fix what you broke?" Ethan nodded. "Not just that. I want to change everything." For the first time in days, a fire ignited in Ethan's chest. He had lost everything. But maybe, just maybe, he had found the one thing that had eluded him his entire life, a purpose worth fighting for. Ethan knew that redemption was not given freely. It had to be earned. With the proof Natalie had provided, he set his mind to the arduous battle ahead. The first step was to expose Richard Kavanaugh's treachery, but that was easier said than done. Richard had allies, and his influence within the company had grown while Ethan had been absent. The corporate machine was a beast that devoured the weak, and Ethan was dangerously close to becoming one of its casualties. The financial records were thorough, but even undeniable proof was worthless if the world refused to believe him. He had to make his case publicly before Richard could bury the evidence. But that meant risking everything, confronting the media that had already decided he was guilty, and walking into a boardroom where he was no longer welcome. He made his way to the company's headquarters, where reporters swarmed the entrance like vultures. Microphones were shoved in his face, questions fired relentlessly. His every step was scrutinized. He ignored the noise, pushing through the crowd with steely resolve. This was no longer about clearing his name, it was about dismantling the corruption that had thrived under his blind watch. Inside the boardroom, a tense silence hung in the air. Richard sat at the head of the table, exuding confidence, his smug grin barely concealed. Around him, members of the board avoided Ethan's gaze, unwilling to align themselves with a man who had seemingly fallen from grace. Ethan placed the folder of evidence onto the long table, his fingers pressing against the polished wood as he steadied himself. He didn't bother with pleasantries. These documents prove that Richard Kavanaugh orchestrated the embezzlement scheme. The signatures were forged, the accounts were manipulated, and the transactions— He exhaled sharply, forcing control over his rising anger. "They were designed to frame me." Richard chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "You're desperate, Ethan. We all saw the reports. We all know the truth." Ethan met his rival's gaze, unwavering. "You don't know the truth, Richard, but you will." He turned toward the board members. "If any of you still believe in justice, you will examine this evidence before making a decision." Murmurs rippled through the room. Doubt began to surface in the eyes of some members, but Richard wasn't ready to surrender his throne just yet. Richard had anticipated Ethan's return. He had prepared for this moment. But what he hadn't prepared for was the depth of Ethan's determination. With the help of Natalie and an external forensic team, Ethan had not only uncovered the fraudulent transactions, but also the secret communications between Richard and a network of shadow investors. These individuals had manipulated stock prices, orchestrated layoffs, and siphoned money into offshore accounts. Richard had not just framed Ethan, he had been bleeding the company dry for years. Ethan took out his phone and, with a tap of his finger, broadcasted a pre-recorded message to the room. It was an intercepted conversation between Richard and his co-conspirators, admitting to fabricating evidence against Ethan. The audio played through the boardroom speakers, each word sinking into the air like a heavy stone. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's expression twisted into something venomous. "You think this changes anything?" he hissed. "You think they'll side with you?" Ethan didn't need to answer. The board members, who had once shunned him, were now staring at Richard with betrayal in their eyes. The tide had turned. Clearing his name wasn't enough. Ethan had seen too much, learned too much. The corruption ran deeper than Richard. It was ingrained within the system itself. Over the next few weeks, Ethan took his fight beyond the corporate halls. He worked alongside investigative journalists, whistleblowers, and advocacy groups. He shared the truth with the world, not just about Richard, but about the exploitation that had fueled the company's rise. Employees who had suffered under Richard's leadership came forward. Former business partners exposed unethical dealings. The walls Richard had built to protect himself crumbled, and soon authorities launched a formal investigation. Richard was arrested. The company's shares plummeted. But something unexpected happened. Rather than collapse, the company began to rebuild under a new vision. Ethan, no longer blinded by greed, led the charge. With the corruption purged, Ethan made a decision. He wouldn't return as the same man he once was. He implemented sweeping changes, restructuring the business model to prioritize ethical leadership and employee welfare. He allocated company profits to social programs, reinvested in the communities affected by past corporate negligence, and vowed to never let power blind him again. But he knew that true redemption wasn't just about fixing a company, it was about fixing himself. He returned to the shelters, not as an outsider, but as someone who had walked in those shoes. He worked alongside Joseph, creating job programs and housing initiatives. He spoke to people who had once been invisible to him, learning their struggles, sharing his own. And in doing so, he found what he had been searching for all along, not power, not success, but purpose. Ethan stood atop the same skyscraper where he had once ruled as an untouchable tycoon. But today, he wasn't there to oversee profits or acquisitions. He was there to witness something far greater, the company he had once nearly lost, now thriving under a new legacy. Natalie approached him, a knowing smile on her lips. "You did it," she said. Ethan watched the city below, the streets filled with people whose lives he had once ignored. "No," he corrected. "We did." As the sun set over the skyline, Ethan Cole knew that this was not the end of his story. It was just the beginning. He had lost everything, but in the end, he had gained something far greater: redemption. With Richard Kavanaugh behind bars and the company's darkest secrets exposed, the dust began to settle. But the war Ethan had waged left behind deep scars, not just within the company, but in himself. He was no longer the man who had built an empire out of ruthless ambition. The board of directors extended an offer for him to reclaim his position as CEO, yet Ethan hesitated. Power had once blinded him, and he wasn't sure he could trust himself with it again. The media frenzy had yet to die down. Headlines debated his redemption. Was Ethan Cole a fallen titan who had learned his lesson, or was he simply a man trying to regain control? His name was no longer synonymous with fraud, but the wounds of public perception were slow to heal. Investors were cautious, employees were skeptical, and the people who had once celebrated his downfall now watched his every move with wary eyes. Ethan took a step back, choosing to observe rather than dictate. He had spent too long ruling from a distance, and now he needed to understand what rebuilding truly meant. The first step toward recovery wasn't restructuring finances or managing public relations. It was mending broken trust. Ethan visited the workers who had suffered under the corruption that once thrived within his company. He sat in factories, met with employees in their homes, and listened to stories of struggles that had been invisible to him before. There was skepticism in their eyes. Forgiveness was not immediate, nor was it owed to him. But Ethan wasn't looking for absolution. He was looking for understanding. He admitted his failures, acknowledged his blind spots, and promised that change would not be dictated from boardroom meetings, but shaped by the very people who had endured the worst of it. He implemented reforms that went beyond corporate policy. Wages were increased, health benefits were expanded, and the company took responsibility for its past wrongdoings by investing in the very communities it had once exploited. These actions weren't met with immediate applause, but they were noticed. And slowly people began to believe that maybe, just maybe, Ethan Cole was no longer the man they had once feared. Rebuilding a company was one thing. Rebuilding himself was another. Ethan had learned through hardship that power was fleeting and wealth was meaningless if it was not used for something greater. His time on the streets had changed him, and he knew he could not turn his back on that world now that he had seen it for what it was. With Joseph's guidance, he helped launch initiatives that provided employment opportunities for the homeless, housing programs for displaced families, and educational funding for underprivileged youth. This wasn't charity, it was accountability. Ethan had once believed that success was measured in profits, but now he saw it measured in lives changed. He no longer sought admiration. He sought impact. The world had once looked at him as nothing more than a businessman, but now he was determined to leave behind a legacy that extended far beyond boardrooms and stock markets. Months passed, and while the road to redemption was long, Ethan walked it without hesitation. The company thrived under its new leadership model, one that valued integrity over profit. Public perception shifted, and though there would always be those who doubted him, Ethan no longer felt the need to prove himself to them. He had already proven himself where it mattered. Standing once more atop the skyscraper he had built, he didn't see power beneath him. He saw responsibility. The city below was no longer a reflection of his empire, but a reminder of the people whose lives were intertwined with his own. Natalie found him there, just as she had the day he reclaimed his name. "So what now?" she asked. Ethan smiled, a quiet confidence in his expression. "Now we build something better." The past could not be undone, but the future was still unwritten. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Cole was not chasing wealth, he was chasing purpose. Ethan Cole had spent his life believing that success was a solitary journey, a race to be won by outmaneuvering others. But now, standing on the other side of destruction and redemption, he realized the truth. It was never about him alone. He had torn down his empire and rebuilt it, not with ambition, but with purpose. The board of directors once again extended their offer for him to reclaim his role as CEO. But this time, he declined. The company was no longer his to command. It belonged to the people who had carried it forward during its darkest days. He appointed a leadership team committed to ethical business practices and ensured that transparency, not greed, would define the company's future. There was no celebration, no grand farewell. Instead, Ethan quietly stepped away, content in the knowledge that the world he had left behind would be better than the one he had once ruled. With his corporate career behind him, Ethan turned his attention to something far more important, creating change where it mattered most. He took his wealth and influence and poured it into projects designed to help those who had been invisible to him before. He partnered with Joseph and other community leaders to expand housing projects, providing sustainable living conditions for displaced families. He funded scholarships for young adults who never had the opportunities he once took for granted. He built outreach programs that gave people more than just temporary aid. They offered a second chance. For the first time in years, Ethan was not seeking power. He was using it. He saw the faces of the people he helped, not as statistics or charity cases, but as individuals with stories, struggles, and dreams. And with each project, each life changed, he found himself healing in ways he never thought possible. The world took notice of Ethan's transformation. Media outlets reached out, eager to tell the story of the fallen billionaire who had dedicated himself to social change. But Ethan refused interviews, declined accolades, and turned down every invitation to step back into the limelight. "This isn't about me," he told Natalie one afternoon. "If people need a symbol, let it be the work, not my name." Natalie, who had stood by him through his darkest days, simply nodded. She understood. Ethan no longer needed recognition to validate his worth. Instead of headlines and awards, he found fulfillment in the simple moments. A child's excitement at receiving their first school book, a struggling mother's relief upon securing stable housing, a homeless man's gratitude for a second chance at employment. and for the first time in his life, he felt at peace. Years passed, and though the world moved on, Ethan remained dedicated to his cause. His name was no longer spoken in the halls of power, but in shelters, schools, and community centers. He had built something greater than wealth. He had built hope. One evening, as he walked through the city that had once been his kingdom, he found himself at the park where his journey had begun. He sat on the same bench where Joseph had first confronted him, and for a moment, he simply watched. Families played, children laughed, and the world moved forward. Joseph, now a leader in his own right, approached him with a knowing smile. Funny how things come full circle, isn't it? Ethan exhaled, nodding. Yeah. But this time, I like where it's going. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan Cole, once a man defined by greed, knew he had found something far more valuable than riches. He had found meaning. Ethan's story reminds us that true success is not measured by wealth or power, but by the impact we leave on the lives of others. His journey from greed to redemption was not easy, but it was necessary. How do you define success? Have you ever had an experience that changed your perspective on what truly matters? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories and reflections can inspire others to rethink their own paths. Life has a way of teaching us lessons when we least expect them. Ethan thought he had control over his destiny, but it wasn't until he lost everything that he realized what truly mattered. What would you do if you had to start over? Would you rebuild the same life, or would you chase something greater?